Hi, I'm Adam, and this is Hope Reserved, where we think through Bible, theology, and worldview. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 2. And in our last episode, we looked at the first chapter of Isaiah, which talked about the violence that was going on in Jerusalem and Judea at the time. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at Isaiah's teaching about the future of the earth. So, we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 11 first. The word which Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judea and Jerusalem. Now it will come about at that in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it, and many peoples will come and say, Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, so that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go out from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he will judge between the nations, and will mediate for many peoples. And they will beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning knives. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. Come, house of Jacob, and let's walk in the light of the Lord. For you have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob, because they are filled with influences from the east, and they are soothsayers like the Philistines. They also strike bargains with the children of foreigners. Their land has also been filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land has also been filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. Their land has also been filled with idols, and they worship the work of their hands, that which their fingers have made. So the common person has been humbled, and the person of importance has been brought low. But do not forgive them. Enter the rocky places, and hide in the dust, from the terror of the Lord, and from the splendor of his majesty. The proud look of humanity will be brought low, and the arrogance of people will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted on that day. So as we look in verses 2 through 4, some people believe that this is just talking about Christ's second coming. And there's also those that believe that this period of time started when Jesus came initially, but will come to its fullness in the second coming. And then 2 through 5. So this was taken from Micah chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. And this is a hymn oracle. And this is likely a hymn oracle that would have been used in temple worship. The phrase, in the last days, is a general term that refers to in God's time. And it can refer to a future time. And there's also a sense that it began with the first coming. So, verse 2, mountains were thought of as the place where God or the gods would live. So that's where a lot of in the pagan religions, they would have sacrifices and all that stuff on mountains. But you also see it in Judaism, where they would go up on the mountains and offer sacrifices to God, like Abraham, and where Moses would meet with God on the mountain. So mountains were as close as you could get to God. It's the highest places you could get on earth. So in ancient thought, that's just where the gods lived. So in this passage, they're looking at Jerusalem as being the chief of the mountains. So it's saying that God will dwell in Jerusalem, and there's also this thought that the gods would rule from the mountains. So in this example, God, when Jesus returns and he rules and reigns from Jerusalem, it is kind of this thought that he would be ruling over the whole earth, and it would also be a place of worship. And the nations would go to Jerusalem to worship God and to learn about him. So, verse 4, talks about beating swords into plowshares. So in this passage, they're referring to a point that would go onto a beam that would be used like a plow. But the word plowshare is actually referring to a more modern plow that would have a part that would overturn the soil. And then the verse talks about the day that world peace would be created with the coming of the Messiah. It talks about his rule and his reign, and it would create an environment where there would be no more war. So this idea of beating these weapons into farm tools, it kind of has this idea that no longer are we going to be killing each other, are the nations all going to be against each other, but we're going to be using our resources to sustain life and to build life and to do positive things rather than negative things, rather than killing, it's sustaining life. And I think that's a huge point of the return of the Messiah. Is it talks about in this passage how he would judge between nations and he would mediate between them. So it no longer do nations just go to war to try to solve disputes, but they would go to the Messiah and he would solve the disputes and there would be no need for war anymore. Verse 5. So this is Isaiah's call to his people. And Isaiah was teaching his people to live in such a way that they would reflect this time when the Messiah was ruling and reigning and help bring it about. So chapter 2 overall describes the time when the nations would come to Jerusalem and they would come to worship God, and they would go there to have disputes settled. So you kind of have this idea of Jerusalem as being the place, the key place in the world to worship God, and also the capital of the world where God would rule and reign from Jerusalem, the holy city. So you kind of see that is a transition from chapter 1 where it was talking about violence in Jerusalem. So it's kind of that idea of this is how it currently is, and it's not really right. And so Isaiah is calling people to, and telling them about what it's going to be and what it should be. And he's calling them to live in this way instead. And then we go on to verses 6 through 22. So this points to a day when God will punish both pagans and Israelites who work against God and his plan. So this warning is not just for Jerusalem and Judea, but it's for all of Israel. So the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. It's often referred to as just Israel. And then verses 6 through 9. So these verses were directed at God. So Isaiah's calling or asking God to do these things to the people. It describes how people have been influenced by the nations around them. They practice magic arts, they make idols, and they're essentially worshiping false gods. They're not worshiping the true God, and they've turned away from the true God. And there's also this, Isaiah talks about prosperity in this time, and it's likely took place, this passage refers to a time under King Uzziah, which was a time of great prosperity for Judea and Jerusalem. So now we're going to go on through chapter 2, 12 through 22. For the Lord of armies will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is arrogant and haughty, and against everyone who is lifted up, that he may be brought low. And it will be against all of the cedars of Lebanon that are lofty and lifted up, against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, against all the hills that are lifted up, against every high tower, against every fortified wall, against the ships of Tarshish, and against all the delightful ships. And the pride of humanity will be humbled, and the arrogance of people will be brought low, and the Lord alone will be exalted on that day. And the idols will completely vanish. People will go into the caves of the rocks and into the holes in the ground and away from the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he arises to terrify the earth. And on that day, people will throw away to the moles and to the bats their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship, in order to go to the clefts of the rock and to the crannies of the clefts before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty, when he arises to terrify the earth. Take no account of man, whose breath of life is in his nostrils, for why should he be esteemed? So verses 10 through 17. God's punishment was for the kingdom of Judea. So Isaiah is talking about the coming of the Assyrians from the north. So this was the beginning of the first exile for the Israelites. And I think it's important to remember that prophecy often had a near-term fulfillment and a fulfillment that was far off. And that's the case with this passage here. As verse 12 alludes to a future judgment. And then verses 11, 17, and 20. So the day of the Lord phrase is used multiple times in this passage. And then verse 16, the trading ships of Tarshish may refer back to the ships of King Solomon or the ships that the Phoenicians used to use to make trade with other nations that were far off. Verse 20, Isaiah repeatedly mentions the futility of idol worship in the book. So the influence of the nations around Israel would get them to worship the gods of the nations around them. So they would make idols as a way of worshiping these false gods or these counterfeit gods. And if you really read deep into Scripture, I believe that they are fallen sons of God that are over the nations, and the people would worship them as if they were God himself. So Isaiah repeatedly mentions the futility of idol worships in this book. So obviously it's one of the 10 Commandments. You should have no other gods before me. So this is an important thing that Israel was going against God. They rejected God and they were worshiping these other gods. So verse 18 through 22, one of the points of anger that God has determined was the result of this idolatry. In the passage, people were throwing away their idols in exchange that they go and hide from the terror of the Lord. I think it's interesting that when the Messiah comes, I think when humans are in the presence of God, we will be incredibly aware of our own sinfulness and brokenness, and we'll know what we've done wrong instantly just by seeing the holiness of God and the holiness of Christ as he returns. So it's interesting to see this response of people. They immediately throw away their idols, they get rid of them, and then they go and hide from God because they knew what they're doing is wrong. Verse 22, the final verse in chapter 2, it teaches to pay no attention to humans, their status, their money, their successes. God doesn't find favor in the successful, the wealthy, the prestigious. And Isaiah is essentially saying, why are you looking at man? Why are you getting your wisdom from man? Why are you esteeming man above God? And we should esteem God above man. It's interesting, God's idea of success is much different than the world's ideas of success. So now I want to go through a few of the key points that are in this passage, and these are some points that I think we can really take away and put in our hearts and apply in our lives. So I think we all have a sense that the world's not right, that things are not how they should be. We see the wicked ruling and reigning. We see injustice. We see violence. There's so much that's wrong with the world. But we all have the sense that something's wrong. And I think this is really a testament to what the Bible teaches about how God put eternity into our hearts. So we have this idea of things should be better, that life shouldn't end, that life should be full and rich and fulfilling. So chapter 2 really gives us a glimpse into how God really does restore Eden on earth, how God once again rules and reigns on the earth. So it's interesting with the Garden of Eden, God intended for man to rule over the earth, and then mankind sinned, and that kind of brought about all of the consequences of that. But now Jesus came as God in the flesh. So once again, a man will rule, but it's also God. So there's no possibility of it getting corrupted or broken or anything, because God himself is ruling and reigning. So this judgment has two sides. So there's the side of the lawbreaker and the side of the innocent who has suffered at the hands of the lawbreaker. So for the person who is against God and his people, the day of the Lord will be a day of terror. It'll be a day of reckoning. And for those who repent of their sins and put their trust in Jesus, the day will be full of joy and hope, because God's ultimate plan is coming closer. It's coming into reality. It's coming to the time when it's supposed to happen. Everything that was once wrong will be made right. And that's one of the greatest things about the book, is the encouragement of what's still to come. And there's a lot of the far-off prophecies that are at least far off from this day, that are still yet to come. And then this passage also talks about pride. So those who elevate themselves, others will be lowered, and those who are humble would be promoted. So Jesus talks about this in Matthew 23:12. Jesus says, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." So you see this idea that what humans value is the opposite of what God values. And really, we live in a world where self-promotion is seen as a virtue. It's seen as something that's important. And we often look at people as successful, or people who are focusing on things that God wouldn't see as successful. They may be a great actor, they may be a great musician, they may be great at something, and the world loves that. And that's not to say that their skill isn't important and that it's not valuable, but I think God values faithfulness and kindness towards others and good relationships and things like that over being rich and famous and successful materially. And you see this inverted idea here with Isaiah when he's saying, "Don't esteem man." And then the final point, the presence of God on earth, it means different things to different people. So if you think about standing before a judge, you have two parties there. You have the person who has been wronged and the person who did the wrong. Well, if you're the person who did the wrong, then judgment is probably seen as something that's bad and scary. And that's kind of the response we see from the people with the idols. They toss them out and they go hide in caves. When they see Christ return, when they see the Messiah, they'll be terrified. But for those who do right, it's a time of joy and hope, because God's plan is moving forward, and the world is being made right. It's being made the way it should be. So I hope you have learned a lot and enjoyed learning from Isaiah chapter 2, and I hope that you'll continue to listen as we go through the book. Thanks for listening.